She was the one who refilled the coffee. Nobody noticed her. Not the senior partners in their tailored suits, not the junior associates with their color-coded binders, not even the receptionist at the front desk who smiled at everyone by name. Delia Marsh moved through the offices of Calloway and Hale like water through cracks in the floor, quietly, completely, and into every corner. She had worked at the firm for 6 years. 6 years of pushing a cart stocked with legal pads, replacement ink cartridges, and individually wrapped mints. 6 years of learning exactly how many sugars Arthur Pennington took in his morning coffee, 2 plus a splash of oat milk he kept in the mini-fridge he thought nobody knew he had. 6 years of listening. That last part was the part nobody knew about. The firm occupied the 14th and 15th floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and it handled the kind of corporate litigation that generated entire forests' worth of paperwork. Calloway and Hale had 43 attorneys, 12 paralegals, and one office services coordinator named Delia Marsh, who was 29 years old, had no law degree, and had read, genuinely read, more case files than half the associates who walked those halls. It wasn't snooping. It was proximity. When you spend 6 years restocking supply rooms that happen to be adjacent to glass-walled conference rooms, you hear things. When you deliver coffee before the 7 a.m. strategy sessions because nobody else is in yet, you see things. When you're the person who collects the documents left in the copy room, the ones people forget about in their rush to their next meeting, you learn things. Delia had a memory that worked like a filing cabinet. Information went in, stayed organized, and could be retrieved on demand. She didn't think of it as anything special. It was just how her mind operated. What she thought of as special was the pattern she'd noticed over the past 8 months. Calloway and Hale was losing Hartfield Properties. Hartfield was the firm's largest client, a real estate development company whose legal needs ran from contract disputes to zoning appeals to the occasional environmental compliance nightmare. They had been with Calloway and Hale for 11 years. They were, as senior partner Jeffrey Calloway once said during a Christmas party. Delia was setting up for the reason we have a second floor, and they were leaving. Delia had put it together piece by piece the way you do when you're not supposed to be looking, but the information keeps falling into your lap anyway. A terse email printout left on the copier in March. An overheard phone call in April when she was delivering a new toner cartridge, and Jeffrey didn't notice she was still in the room. A follow-up meeting in May where the Hartfield representatives had left without shaking hands. She had also noticed something else. The firm kept losing Hartfield's cases on a very specific technicality, a misreading of municipal zoning ordinances that had compounded over 3 separate matters, creating a liability that was going to cost Hartfield somewhere in the range of $4 million. The attorneys at Calloway and Hale hadn't caught it because they were specialists in commercial litigation, not land use. They were, as far as Delia could tell, looking at every piece of the puzzle except the one in the middle. She knew what the middle piece looked like. She didn't know what to do with that knowledge. For 2 months she sat with it. She told herself it wasn't her place. She told herself she was the supply cart girl and nobody was going to listen to the supply cart girl explain municipal zoning law to a room full of attorneys. She told herself that even if she was right, and she was fairly certain she was right, saying so out loud would accomplish nothing except making her look ridiculous. She had been looked at like she was ridiculous before. She knew exactly how that felt. It settled in the chest like a cold stone and stayed there for days. So she kept quiet, she kept restocking, she kept listening. And then one Tuesday morning in September, she walked into the supply room adjacent to the main conference room at 6:47 a.m. to restock the presentation supplies, and she heard Jeffrey Calloway on the phone say, "If we don't fix this by the end of the month, Hartfield's gone. $4 million in annual billing gone. I don't care what it costs, I need someone to figure out what we're doing wrong." He hung up. Delia stood very still with a box of dry erase markers in her hand. She thought about the cold stone feeling. She thought about how it had been easier to stay quiet. She thought about 6 years of watching people in this building make decisions, good ones, bad ones, ones they'd regret, and how not once had anyone in a position to make those decisions ever looked at her and wondered what she might know. She put the dry erase markers on the shelf. Then she walked to the supply closet, took out a legal pad, the good ones, the ones she kept for the senior partners, and spent the next 40 minutes writing out everything she knew. The emergency partners meeting was called for that Friday at 3 p.m. Delia had been asked to set up the conference room. Water pitchers, printed agendas, the specific arrangement of chairs that Jeffrey preferred for formal meetings. She did all of that. Then she sat the legal pad on the table in front of one of the empty chairs, set a pen beside it and went back to get the water. There were 9 people in that room when the meeting began. 8 of them were partners or senior associates. One of them was Delia, standing near the door with a pitcher of water she had no intention of leaving with. Jeffrey opened by laying out the situation plainly. Hartfield was threatening to take their business to a competing firm unless Calloway and Hale could demonstrate a substantive understanding of where the previous counsel had gone wrong and how it would be corrected. He gave them 2 weeks. He did not look confident about those 2 weeks. The discussion that followed was, in Delia's assessment, polite, thorough, and completely missing the point. She refilled 3 water glasses. She waited. She told herself this was not her moment, that she should set down the pitcher and leave quietly, that she had written everything on the legal pad and could leave it anonymously and let someone smarter looking than her carry it into the conversation. And then Associate Director Harrison Boyle said, with the specific confidence of someone who does not know what he doesn't know, "The problem is precedent. We need to find a case that repositions our interpretation of the zoning dispute in Hartfield's favor, and frankly I think we've been looking at this from the right angle all along." There was a murmur of agreement around the table. Delia set down the water pitcher. She raised her hand. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something happens that the room's occupants did not know was possible. Jeffrey Calloway turned slowly to look at her. Harrison Boyle stared. Margaret Finch, the partner who handled Hartfield's account directly, blinked twice. "Delia." Jeffrey said it the way you say something when you're not entirely sure it's real. "Can I? Do you need something?" "No," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I think I need to say something." Nobody told her to leave. That surprised her. "I've been following the Hartfield matters for several months," she said. "I know how that sounds. I'm not an attorney. I understand that. But I've had access to a lot of the documentation. Through my work, not through anything improper. And I've noticed a pattern in the zoning analysis that I think is the actual source of the problem." She picked up the legal pad. "The issue isn't precedent," she said, looking briefly at Harrison, who was now looking at her the way you look at something that has unexpectedly started speaking. "It's the municipal code amendment that went into effect 18 months ago in Cook County. The amendment reclassified a subset of mixed-use properties in a way that changed the applicable setback requirements. Every Hartfield dispute that's gone sideways in the last year involves properties that fall under that reclassification." She set the legal pad on the table and slid it toward the center. "I wrote it out. The specific ordinance sections, the dates, the properties. I also wrote out what I think the correct argument looks like based on 3 cases from the Illinois Appellate Court from 2019 and 2021. You'd want an actual attorney to review all of it, and I'd expect them to find things I've missed. But I think the core of it is there." The room was still quiet. Jeffrey Calloway leaned forward and pulled the legal pad toward him. Nobody laughed. That had been her biggest fear, that they would laugh, the way people laugh at someone who has stepped outside the role assigned to them. She had rehearsed in the back of her mind how she would stand very straight and walk out of the room if they did. She had prepared for it. They didn't laugh. What happened instead was that Jeffrey read the first page of her notes without speaking, and then handed it to Margaret Finch, who read the next 2 pages, and then the room had the quality of air before a thunderstorm. Everything held very still. Harrison Boyle said, "Where did you get this?" "I put it together," Delia said, "from what I'd observed. And from research I did on my own time." "On your own time, yes." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read the expression entirely. Part of it, she thought, was something close to embarrassment. Jeffrey looked up from the legal pad. "How long have you been with us?" 6 years, doing supply coordination." "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "And in that time, have you brought anything like this forward before?" "No. Why not?" She thought about the cold stone feeling, about learning to stay in her lane because nobody had ever suggested her lane could be anywhere else. "I wasn't sure anyone would want to hear it," she said. Jeffrey nodded slowly. It was not the nod of a man dismissing something. It was the nod of a man absorbing something he should have already known. "We're going to need you to walk us through this," he said. "All of it. Every piece. Can you stay?" She looked at the empty chair with the legal pad in front of it. "Yes," she said, "I can stay." She stayed for 4 hours. By the end of it, Margaret Finch had called Hartfield's general counsel and arranged an emergency presentation for the following Tuesday. Jeffrey had contacted the firm's land use expert in the Milwaukee office to review Delia's analysis overnight. Harrison Boyle had said almost nothing for the final 2 hours, which she suspected was its own kind of answer. Before Delia left the conference room that evening, Jeffrey stopped her at the door. "The analysis you put together," he said, "it's solid. Better than solid. It's exactly what we've been missing. Thank you. I want to ask you something directly. He said it like he meant it to be a real question, not a formality. What do you actually want, professionally? If you could answer that honestly. Delia thought about how strange it was to be asked. Nobody had ever asked. I'd like to do work that uses what I'm good at, she said. I don't know exactly what that looks like inside a law firm, but I'd like the chance to figure it out. Jeffrey nodded. Come see me Monday morning, before the building fills up. She went home and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. She felt something quieter than that. Like a door had opened in a wall. She'd stopped expecting to have doors. Monday came. Before we go further, if you've ever been in a position where you had something real to offer but couldn't figure out how to make anyone see it, leave a comment. It matters more than you might think to know you're not alone in that. Jeffrey's office was on the 15th floor, corner position, with a view of the river that Delia had always seen from the outside when she came to water the plants on the windowsill. She had never sat in the chair across from his desk. It was comfortable. She noted that with a small private humor. Jeffrey told her 3 things. First, the Milwaukee land use attorney had reviewed her analysis and called it, and she was quoting him directly because Jeffrey had written it down. The clearest articulation of this specific issue I've seen from anyone who isn't billing $400 an hour. Second, the firm wanted to bring her in on the Hartfield presentation in a formal capacity, not as support staff but as a contributing analyst. Her name would be on the materials. Third, and this was the one that made her go very still, the firm was willing to fund her legal education part-time if she wanted it. We have a program for internal candidates, Jeffrey said. We've never had someone from operations go through it. That's our oversight, not a policy. You'd work reduced hours, we'd cover tuition, and when you passed the bar, we'd have a conversation about what comes next. Delia looked at the river. That's a significant investment, she said carefully. It is, Jeffrey said. I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think it was sound. He paused. I also want to be transparent with you. Part of why I'm having this conversation is that we should have had it years ago. That's not an apology. I'm not sure apologies accomplish much at this point. It's just an acknowledgement. She appreciated that, the honesty of it. I want to think about it, she said. Not because I'm uncertain. Because I want to say yes with a clear head, not a surprised one. Jeffrey smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile in 6 years that wasn't directed at a client. Take the week. She took 3 days. What she kept coming back to wasn't the opportunity itself. She wanted that, clearly, straightforwardly, in a way she'd learned not to examine too closely, because wanting things you couldn't see a path to was its own kind of ache. What she kept coming back to was the question Jeffrey had asked her. Why didn't you say something before? She had given him the surface answer. The truth underneath it was more complicated. She had grown up being the smart kid in rooms where being the smart kid didn't get you very far, where it got you labeled as difficult or uppity or someone who needed to be reminded of their place. She had learned the way you learn things that nobody teaches you directly, that being right was only useful if you had the right kind of background to give your rightness weight. She had spent years in a building full of people who had that background. She had decided, without really deciding, that she didn't belong in the same category. It had taken one moment, one raised hand, one water pitcher set down on a table, to start questioning that decision. She thought about all the other people who hadn't set down the pitcher, who were, right now, in rooms somewhere, knowing something that nobody was asking them, having learned the same quiet lesson she had. That thought made her feel something complicated. Not quite anger, something more patient than anger. On Thursday, she called Jeffrey's assistant and said she was ready to talk. The Hartfield presentation was on Tuesday. She stood in the conference room in a blazer she had borrowed from her sister, with her analysis printed and bound and distributed to the 5 Hartfield representatives who sat across the table with the particular expression of people who had come prepared to be disappointed. Margaret Finch opened the presentation. Jeffrey provided context, and then Margaret said, I'd like to turn it over to Delia Marsh, who identified and developed the core of the analysis you're seeing. Delia looked at the 5 faces across the table. She thought, one raised hand. She began. She talked for 38 minutes. She walked them through the Cook County Amendment, through the reclassification, through the 3 appellate cases that established the correct interpretive framework. She walked them through specifically how the error had compounded across Hartfield's 3 disputed properties, and what a corrected legal strategy would look like, and what the projected outcomes of that strategy were, based on comparable precedent. The Hartfield representatives asked 12 questions. She answered 11 of them directly and said, "For this 12th, that's a question for Margaret. It involves a procedural decision that needs to come from the attorney of record," which was the true answer, and also, she suspected, the one that made Margaret look at her with an expression of something very close to respect. At the end, the Hartfield General Counsel, a quiet man named Thomas who had barely moved during the entire presentation, sat back in his chair and said, "How long has she been with your firm?" 6 years, Jeffrey said. Thomas looked at Delia for a moment. Then he looked at Jeffrey. "And she's been in supply coordination, operations support," Jeffrey said. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'd like 10 minutes with Ms. Marsh privately before we leave." The 10 minutes ran to 40. Thomas Aldridge had been Hartfield Properties General Counsel for 9 years. He was, Delia would learn, a man who had a very specific allergy to wasted potential. He'd grown up watching it happen to people he loved, and he'd developed a habit of intervening when he saw it happening to others. He asked her about the analysis. He asked her about how she developed it. He asked her about her background, not in the way people asked as a way of sorting you into a category, but in the way people ask when they're actually trying to understand something. And then he told her that Hartfield was in the process of building out its internal legal team, and that he was specifically looking for people who could sit at the intersection of legal analysis and operational knowledge. People who understood how large-scale property development actually functioned on the ground, not just in court. "That's an unusual combination to find," he said. "I imagine so," Delia said. "You have it," he said it simply, without performance. "I'm not going to make you a formal offer in a conference room after a 40-minute conversation. That would be premature and also somewhat inappropriate given the circumstances. But I would like to stay in touch, if you're open to it." She was open to it. 3 months later, Delia Marsh was enrolled part-time in the evening law program at DePaul University, funded by Callaway and Hale's internal scholarship. She had moved from operations support into a newly created research analyst position, not because she'd demanded it, and not because she'd maneuvered for it, but because Jeffrey had restructured a role to fit what the firm actually needed and discovered, in doing so, that what they needed had been there all along. Harrison Boyle, to his credit, had stopped in her office doorway one afternoon about 6 weeks after the Hartfield meeting. He'd stood there for a moment like he was deciding something. "The zoning analysis," he said. "You were right and I was wrong. I wanted to say that directly." She had looked at him for a moment. She hadn't expected it. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. There was a difference, she'd learned, between people who couldn't handle being wrong and people who just hadn't been invited to consider it yet. Harrison, it turned out, was the second kind. Thomas Aldridge had stayed in touch. They'd had 3 phone calls and 1 coffee meeting in the 5 months since the Hartfield presentation, each one longer and more substantive than the last. Hartfield was still in the process of expanding its in-house team. Thomas was still, he said, looking for the right people. "I want to ask you something," he said at the coffee meeting, "and I want you to take it seriously as a real question, not a hypothetical. All right? If you were building an in-house legal and operations team from scratch, the kind that would handle everything from zoning compliance to contract disputes to the due diligence on major acquisitions, what would you build?" She set down her coffee cup. She thought about supply carts and conference rooms, about 6:47 a.m. and dry erase markers, about a legal pad slid across a table and a hand raised in a room full of people who hadn't asked for it. She talked for 45 minutes. He took notes. She didn't get a job offer that day. She got one 4 months after that, when she was halfway through her first year of law school and the research analyst role had quietly become something that no longer had a precise title, because she kept doing things that didn't fit neatly into the existing categories. The offer was for Director of Legal Operations at Hartfield Properties. It included a provision for Hartfield to cover the remainder of her tuition. It was structured, Thomas had said with a slight smile when he sent it, in a way that suggests we're making a long-term bet, which we are. She read it at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat 6 months earlier after a 4-hour meeting she hadn't planned to be part of, feeling something quiet instead of triumphant. She felt something quiet again now, but different, like the first time had been a door opening, and this was what was on the other side of it. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in that conference room supply closet and told herself it wasn't her place, who had rehearsed walking out with her head straight, who had carried the cold stone for years because nobody had told her to put it down, and she hadn't thought to do it herself. She wanted to tell that version something. She wasn't entirely sure what. Maybe just, the picture is heavier than the legal pad. You're allowed to set it down. She picked up her pen and signed her name at the bottom of the offer letter. The view from the 14th floor had always looked like a city full of rooms she wasn't in. She was starting to understand, slowly and without drama, that the rooms had never actually been locked. She had just been standing on the wrong side of the door, waiting for someone to open it, when all along what she needed to do was knock.